I'm David Knowles, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, we discuss the Russian destruction of the ruined theatre in Mariupol. We look at the recent car bomb in Melitopol, and we compare Volodymyr Zelensky's trip to Washington to Winston Churchill's visit to the White House at the height of the Second World War in December 1941.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets the world over.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Friday, the 23rd of December, day 303. Today, to discuss the most recent events in Ukraine and around the world, I'm joined by our associate editor Dominic Nichols and our senior reporter and history correspondent Daniel Capuro. I started by asking Dom for the latest news from Ukraine.
Well, hi, David. Hi, everybody. So there's been a car bomb, by the look of it, in Melitopol. So this is a southern port city, Russian-occupied at the moment, port city of Melitopol. There are reports suggesting that there are two people in the car injured, one possibly lost a limb, and reports suggesting that they might be FSB, so Russian security agents. However, I can't find where that claim has come from, that they're FSB. So Ivan Fedorov, who is the exiled Ukrainian mayor of Melitopol, he's confirmed the explosion on his Telegram channel, but said the identity of the victims was still being, quote, clarified. So I've yet to see anywhere that have said it's FSB. However, this does fit a pattern in that area of Ukraine. There have been a number of attacks by partisans, or we don't know who they are. I mean, there's some suggestion it's Ukrainian special forces. Very unlikely. We think these are civilian partisans. So we don't really know, but that has happened in the last 24 hours. I mean, Melitopol is the area where the main bridge, you might remember this a couple of weeks ago, the main bridge was hit by unexplained explosions. And this is one of the bridges across on that land corridor down through to Crimea that we know is absolutely vital to Putin for support of Russian forces in Crimea. So that bridge was hit recently and rendered it virtually impassable, and certainly, by the look of it, impassable to heavy equipment, tanks and artillery and what have you. Elsewhere, in Mariupol, so this is slightly further to the east along the coast, Russian forces have been occupying Mariupol since earlier this year have started to dismantle the theatre, the main theatre there, where reports are suggesting up to 600 were killed in a strike in March. No one knows for sure because they've just not been able to get in there, and Russia are now, well, they put up a load of screens around it quite early on, so the locals that were still there in the city, thought to number some tens of thousands, just couldn't see what was happening there. However, footage that's on social media show hardware diggers and what have you demolishing the last of the walls that are standing, and there's suggestions that this is just eradicating the evidence of war crimes and so on and so forth. But we shall. Well, I don't know if we will see, actually. I mean, it was bombed on March the 16th, and it was being used to house civilians. Anywhere from a dozen to 600 has been named as, or been the kind of numbers that have been discussed around the people that were in there. I'll leave that. I think Dan's going to talk a little bit more about that shortly. Just two more quickies on the news. So, the Russian installed official in the Zaporizhia region, which hosts obviously the nuclear power plant there, he said today that shelling of the nuclear power plant had, quote, almost stopped. He was speaking on Russian state television, and he said that Russian troops would not leave the nuclear plant. It would never return to Ukrainian control. Fine. You can say what he likes. It's all a bit of a muchness. But the fact, I mean, so it's good and bad, right? That nobody wants it to be shelled. It's hotly disputed where that fire is coming from. There's no reason for those forces to be there. It's a stupid place to put them unless you are using it as a base for your own military ends, which is extremely reckless, bordering on a war crime, I would think, using civilian infrastructure for that for those means. And finally, the Wagner Group. So last night, John Kirby, White House National Security spokesman, said that North Korea, that he confirmed a delivery last month from North Korea of small arms, infantry rockets, missiles, etc., to Wagner, the paramilitary group funded, we think, run by Yevgeny Prigozhin. Wagner group largely been contained in the centre of the Donbass, particularly around the city of Bakhmut. And John Kirby said that the US are going to impose further sanctions on the group because this kind of sale of military hardware to a civilian firm, the type of weapons that have been sold, go against it's in violation of the UN Security Council resolutions. He said, so Mr. Kirby, is saying the Wagner Group is spending more than $100 million each month on its Ukraine operations and is seeking to set itself up as a rival, as a separate power base, a rival to the established Russian military. We spoke before about any political ambition for Yevgeny Prigozhin and other sort of warlords like Kadyrov, for example, the Chechen leader. So it's interesting here that the US is commenting on Russian supply from North Korea for their paramilitary forces. A bit more later on the $45 billion package from the US, but I'll let others jump in.
Thanks very much for all of that, Dom. Dan, I know you've got notes on almost all of the stories we've just talked about, but can we bring you in first on this story on the Wagner Group? Why would North Korea do something like this? Why are they funding the Wagner Group in Russia?
Yeah, it's interesting with North Korea supplying these weapons. So obviously we've seen states that have poor relations with the West, like Iran, supplying Russia with weapons. But this is a slightly different case, and you've got them supplying them directly to a group of mercenaries. But North Korea is sort of a particularly interesting country when it comes to this stuff. It is, in a lot of ways, to all intents and purposes, a mafia. It's an illustration of what happens when you really are cut off entirely from the global economy. You know, as much as there are sanctions on Russia, some business is still going ahead, as we've seen with gas and oil, but certain countries, North Korea being the prime example, really are just completely cut off. The main thing propping it up is Chinese support. But obviously it has to survive. They have to give elite lifestyles to the elite, and most importantly, they have to get access to high-tech equipment, to technology, and to US dollars, which are essential for buying certain things that are needed in North Korea, and particularly things that the elite like. And so what we've seen in North Korea is that it has become this mafia state, and it's believed to be involved in any number of criminal activities effectively sponsored by the state. So, the regular stuff like gun running, drug smuggling, all these kind of things, then to the more obscure. A few years ago, The Telegraph reported on the fact that North Korean diplomats in Africa had been involved in wildlife smuggling and in ivory smuggling. And basically, the North Korean government will do anything it can to get its hands on hard currency to prop up what is a really decrepit economy and to keep its elite happy and sweet. And I think you can see that in the Wagner deal, where it's just a very easy way for them to get hold of foreign currency and hard cash for one of the few things that actually North Korea does have decent supplies of, which is weapons.
Thanks, Dan. Dom has given us the news of the destruction of the bombed theatre in Mariupol. What I'd quite like you to do as our history correspondent is put this erasure of war crimes. I mean, this is what we saw earlier in the year, as Dom said, that this bombing of the theatre, and killing of hundreds of civilians. I mean, it's one of the sort of images of the war, isn't it? The word children outside in front of this to deter Russian aviation from bombing it, and actually they went ahead and did it anyway. Now this crime scene is being removed. Can you put that into context for us in Russian military history, looking back to the Red Army as well?
Absolutely, yeah, and I think what's going on here, we have this perhaps sort of sanitized understanding of what happens with war crimes and these things that, it's very difficult to cover up when you have killed hundreds of people, thousands of people, and that eventually when the good guys win, these things are uncovered and the evidence is there, and it's very easy to say exactly what happened and who did it and who's responsible and put them on trial. And the reality, of course, is always much, much messier and sort of realpolitik and pragmatism gets in the way. You certainly saw that with Nazi war crimes at the end of the Second World War, that a lot of perpetrators really, but people maybe on the edge of these things who, at least in the early years of the Cold War, were let back into the establishment and society, no questions asked, because it was useful and convenient. Whether or not that will happen with Russia at the end of this war is sort of still to be seen, but I think that in terms of covering up and seeing this demolition of the theatre, this war is is very different to ones we've seen previously, where obviously we have satellite imagery. We're all able to see what's happened to the theatre. You can see in satellite images the word Deti, Russian for children, on the front in huge, enormous letters. So the West's able to see what happened, even if we don't know the truth of what's gone on within the building and how many people were really in there. And that will be an enormous undertaking to find out what really happened. But one of the sort of historic examples, I think, that immediately springs to mind, and one that will be very familiar, I think, certainly to our listeners in Eastern Europe, is the Katyn massacre of the early stages of the Second World War. It's not always particularly well known in the West. It's very, very brief potted history, but after the Nazi-Soviet pact, everyone remembers that the Germans invaded Western Poland. They tend to forget that Eastern Poland was invaded by the Soviet Union. And the intelligentsia and the officer class of the Polish army were rounded up in woods, which are now, I believe, in Belarus. Do correct me if I'm wrong. And were summarily executed. I think that the rough figure is 22,000. And an entire class of intelligentsia of the future leaders of Poland was wiped out over a few weeks. I know that regular listeners will have heard earlier in this week about the executed Renaissance with Ukraine during the Great Purge, where Stalin did something very similar to the Ukrainians and tried to obliterate their intelligentsia. But yeah, so this happened in 1940 in Poland. And then what happened afterwards? Well, there wasn't any outside access to what was going on. No one really knew that it had happened apart from Poles who weren't able to get the news out. But then, of course, the front moved. And I believe in 1943, German forces uncovered these enormous mass graves in the woods and reported it. And obviously for them, it was this great propaganda coup where they could point to the horrors of the Red Army and the Soviet Union and try and show that the West, that the Allies were enormously hypocritical for allying themselves with the Soviet. And for convenience, the United States in particular, but Britain to an extent, sort of helped, or at least turned a blind eye to the cover-up. Winston Churchill was adamant that the Red Cross should not be allowed to go to Katyn to investigate, because on the basis that they wouldn't be able to investigate freely, that the Nazis would force them into producing a propaganda report. And it was sort of deliberately, the waters were deliberately, and there were suggestions that the Nazis had done this themselves, a sort of false flag operation to then blame the Soviets. The Nazis actually pulled a couple of American POWs out of a camp and sent them to Katyn to kind of give some legitimacy to their claims. And those two prisoners then later secretly managed to get in touch with Washington and tell them that no, actually it was true and they were not under pressure, that it was the case that this was almost certainly done by the Red Army. After the war in the 1950s, there was sort of big repercussions for this in the West for, why they had helped cover it up. But despite the fact that in the 50s, Westerners kind of came to realize what had actually happened, that it was in fact the Red Army and the wool was removed from their eyes by the reality of the Cold War. The Cold War also meant that the real truth of what happened there was suppressed and was unable to be told. And of course in Poland there was very, very strict censorship around this. People were not allowed to even mention the word. And perhaps the most cynical thing that the Soviet Union did was that the Eastern War was incredible. The Eastern Front was incredibly brutal. There were massacres of entire villages all the time, particularly in Belarus. And any one of these could have been memorialized and turned into kind of the emblematic village that would be the one around which commemorations would be focused. But the Soviet government deliberately chose a place called Katyn, which to Westerners at least, or anyone sort of not familiar with Slavic languages, is really not very different to Katyn, similar spelling. And the historian Norman Davis has sort of done research and argued that this was deeply, deeply cynical and deliberate attempt to basically confuse anyone who might try and look up the Katyn massacre and understand what had happened. And even to this day, there's this huge memorial in Katyn in Belarus, and it does muddy the waters. And of course, it wasn't until Glasnost and Perestroika that the Soviet Union really kind of admitted what had happened and opened up the archives, and Gorbachev revealed the orders from the NKVD, the secret police, to commit the massacre. But yeah, so sort of a grim tale all around, and one that is a very important story in Polish history. But it's kind of a reminder of the fact that these things are never clear cut. It's not the case that the war crime happens, the good guys turn up, they investigate, and everything is revealed to be true. Often there's very long fights and lots of difficulty in documenting this, And even after the war, people do their best to muddy the waters and to confuse things. And so, the question is, what will we actually, what will investigators find, hopefully, when they're finally able to visit the scene, and what will be left, what evidence will be left, and will we ever be able to find out what really happened there?
Well, thank you very much for that, Dan. Just wanted your thoughts on this possible partisan strike in Melitopol that Dom told us about earlier. This car bomb that's gone off and killed 2 potential FSB agents.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's been, from what I understand, it's been one of the more active areas of partisan warfare and relatively successful partisan warfare. Obviously, on that front, it's been very hard to find out what's going on, quite rightly, and it's being kept very secret. But I think, again, and perhaps sticking to slightly gloomy subjects here, but we've heard again about how hopefully when these sort of eastern regions of Ukraine are liberated, chances are we'll find evidence of really quite horrible things. Many more butchers, I think, is the way it's been phrased. And I think here it's interesting to look at the context of how and why conflicts like these end up turning quite so brutal and so nasty, and also the fact that the Russian army, previously the Soviet army, and the Red Army before that have a long track record of war crimes, which I think we've talked about before. I certainly think I've talked about before on this podcast. But in this case, it's quite a familiar tale, I think, of how the sort of indisciplined, unscrupulous armies turn to horrendous tactics and war crimes when faced with partisan warfare. And in this case, sort of Afghanistan, I think, is quite illustrative of what's gone on, but you see it elsewhere, for example, in Colombia in the kind of the civil war that they had, where partisans effectively can operate freely in an enormous geography. So in the case of Ukraine, you've got this kind of vast area. You've got a willing population that wants to support the partisans, and you have an understaffed Russian army that can never possibly search enough homes or dominate a large enough geographical area. In Afghanistan, it was impenetrable mountains and canyons and valleys, and in Colombia, sort of the jungle and the mountains and things like this. But what you see is that you get these partisan attacks, and then in the eyes of the commanders, sort of unscrupulous commanders, the only way to respond, if you can't dominate the geography and you can't predict where the enemy is going to be, is to cut off their supplies, which means attacking civilians, which means making it so costly and painful to support a partisan that you would never do it again. And of course, the way they do that is by massacring people. And you saw it all over Afghanistan during the Soviet invasion. Huge numbers of and again, going back to the point I was making earlier, very poorly documented and poorly understood, but these villages all across Afghanistan where local Soviet commanders would round up the entire village and just shoot everyone, man, woman, and child. And of course, these people were innocent civilians. They might have given food or shelter or supplies to the partisans. They themselves were not involved in partisan warfare necessarily, but it was the way of, if you can't dominate the geography, you cut off the supplies and you make it totally inhospitable. And you see this kind of very rapid brutalization of the conflict and of the civilians and of the soldiers perpetrating the crimes. So I guess the broader point being, I wouldn't be surprised if later on, when Ukrainian troops hopefully liberate the city, that you may find worse retaliation again.
Thanks very much, Dan. Dom, do you want to come in on that yourself?
Yeah, I'll just make the point there to follow on what Dan was saying, that these reprisals against civilians, I mean, this is a feature of warfare, not all wars, and not all the time. But I mean, if you think about the military mind here, I mean, hyper vigilant is the state that these people will be in. I.e., they are fearful. They're looking over their shoulder all the time. They are constantly worried for their own. They're in an alien landscape, especially if you're an invading army. You think, how many people are actively trying to work against you. And if we look through history, and if you look back at what the car bomb was in the 70s and 80s, it was this fearful weapon that, like, every potential car, we're thinking Belfast or Beirut, elsewhere in Northern Ireland, elsewhere across the UK, and in other conflicts around the world, every single car that you patrol past as a soldier could be the one that goes off. So the car bomb in the 70s and 80s took on this totemic image of the means with which a civilian population can resist and push back. and kill. And then that sort of morphed in the 2000s into kind of Iraq and Afghanistan years into the IED, the improvised explosive device, erroneously called roadside bombs because they could be anywhere. It could be roads, footpaths, walls, streams, anything. And I remember from Afghanistan the fear that this instilled in soldiers, that every single step could be onto one of these things. And again, it's just that the IED, what the IED was in the 2000s, I'm suggesting that the car bomb was in the 70s and 80s, and it just puts that fear into your mind. Well, when there are attacks obviously from a civilian, I mean these are all from civilians clearly, but if there's something that speaks of a partisan movement, then I can it's only a short step through a looking glass of ill discipline, poorly trained, no moral centre of a military force to then seek reprisals against a civilian population. So you can't take reprisals against a car bomb. You can't take reprisals against an IED directly. Obviously, you go for the network, and that's what we did. But I can see how an ill-disciplined, ill-equipped, poorly led military force, such as we've seen Russia try to field in Ukraine, will look at some of this partisan activity and just revert to historical norms and attack the civilian population. So this is, as Dan said, this is been an ever-present feature of warfare. It comes from a position of fear and impotence on the part of the Russian soldiers here against what they see as an omnipotent and ever-present threat from as they would imagine the partisans to be everywhere. So I think we're going to see a lot more of this, quite frankly.
Well, thanks, Dan and Dom. Dom, can I stay with you? Let's move away from some of the history and come to some of the news from this week that I think we should delve into. Dom, you've been looking more into the US aid package to Ukraine, which we spoke about yesterday. Can you take us through what you've seen in that package?
Yeah, sure. So this was from Tuesday's announcement in Washington. It was picked up by The Hill, a DC-based media outlet, and thank you, Henry, for pointing this out to me, putting me towards the detail. So I mentioned yesterday about the $45 billion package. Let's first of all put that into context. So this is the fourth package this year that the US have passed in support of Ukraine. So 13.6 billion in March, 40 billion May, 12.3 billion in September. So a lot of money. And for this year alone, 2022, that takes the total military, humanitarian, and economic assistance that the US have provided for Ukraine just over $110 billion. I mean, a staggering amount of money. And it is easy to get lost in the numbers, which is why I asked David for this opportunity just to sort of take stock here, pause for a moment at the end of the year, and sort of dig into this latest package as an example of what this means, because the numbers are massive and it's very easy, as I say, to get lost in the detail. But this $45 billion announced on Tuesday, which included, as we were talking about the Patriot missile system yesterday, but let's have a look at the $45 billion. So I'm going to round up round down as appropriate, just for ease of figures. So $12 billion to replenish US weapon stocks that have already been gifted. So that's stuff that was on the shelf that the US just gave straight away to Ukraine, military hardware. So now $12 billion there that goes out to industry, mainly US industry, to replenish the US military. Another $9 billion to go to the Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, which is the sort of training, equipment, and intelligence support to Ukraine. $7 billion going to US's European Command. So that's their intelligence support, that's pay, equipment, and other bits and bobs. 300 million. Now this is very interesting. 300 million for advanced nuclear reactors and advanced nuclear fuels to help increase Ukraine's energy security, and a further 126 million to help Ukraine prepare for, I'm quoting here, prepare for and respond to potential nuclear and radiological incidents in Ukraine. So we've been talking about the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, and you've heard Hamish de Bretton-Gordon speak on here many times about the threats there to the nuclear power plants and what could happen if they continue to be attacked. And so I mean that's a huge amount of money. There's 426 million there to directly for nuclear security, but also responding to any potential incident. There's also about $2.5 billion for humanitarian needs in Ukraine, just over 13 billion in direct economic support, and 2.5 billion to help resettle Ukrainian refugees into the US. So there's huge numbers. This bill, 4,155 pages of it. It's got to be passed by the House and the Senate and signed off by President Biden. But there's every likelihood, I mean, that is going to happen before the year's end, and that'll, as I say, that'll lead to those numbers I've said: 110 billion for the year, the fourth package of multi-billion-dollar assistance to Ukraine. So I just wanted to sort of take stock here at the end of the year and try and flesh out what this money is going on, to show you the range of activity that this is. It's not just a military effort, it's not just economic and diplomatic. There's a whole host of stuff going on there. I mean, 2.4 billion to help resettle Ukrainian refugees into the US is staggering. I'll have to dig into that. I'm not quite sure how many people have gone and what that support consists of. Be really keen to hear from any of our listeners who have experience of this program, who are maybe hosting Ukrainian refugees themselves. Be delighted to speak to you. But no, I think it's a staggering amount of money. I don't use that as a stick to say to other countries, well, you've got to do this and you've got to do that. I mean, now's not necessarily the time for that. I've done that throughout the year as and when appropriate. But I just wanted to mark here what that $45 billion from Tuesday consists of. Of course, in the light of a new mix in the House next year, with Republicans in the majority, and these comments about blank checks. And interestingly, Zelensky addressed that directly yesterday on Wednesday with his joint statement, or saying to the joint houses, saying about how responsible Ukraine is going to be with the money. I think trying to address some of those concerns that have been voiced, and legitimately so. I mean, we need to look at this, and they're going to come to the fore, I think, in the new year with the Republicans in the House. But that's it for now. Just wanted to take a little moment there, and there'll be more to come.
Well, thanks, Don, for looking more in detail at some of the things announced during President Zelensky's visit to Washington. Dan Kapuru, as our history correspondent, it would be very remiss of us not to ask you for some of your thoughts on Zelensky's visit. I mean, there were lots of comparisons drawn with former British PM Winston Churchill's visits to the US during the Second World War, and there were some criticisms of Zelensky that we saw from some media sources and some others. You've been looking at Churchill's visit. What comparisons and what differences have you found?
Yeah, the Churchill comparison is one that I think Zelensky himself is deliberately playing up. He knows almost even more so than in the United Kingdom, which sounds extraordinary. The US, or at least Washington, and politicians there, have this cult of Churchill, kind of the same one that we have here of kind of the greatest leader of all time. American politicians really love it, and as we've seen with Zelensky, he knows his audiences. So depending on which country he's speaking to, he tends to sort of tailor it to their history, their finest hours and darkest hours and the like. But the Churchill well, if you like, is one he's returned to again and again. So I think it's a perfectly legitimate comparison to make. And I think the most interesting and the most useful parallel when it comes to Churchill is what is the point of a prime minister, of a leader of war? And I think Zelensky's success, some people have criticised him for it, I think completely wrongly. His success has been to be the chief media officer, if you like, of Ukraine, or the chief propagandist, or however you want to see it. But he's understood that his role, both within Ukraine and outside of Ukraine, has been to be a symbol, basically. To be defiant, to say, early on in the war, I'm not leaving Kiev. I don't need a lift. I need ammunition, I think was the famous line. Being defiant and kind of channeling the Ukrainian public, and being that kind of proving that you can stay. If the president of Ukraine had fled in those early days of the war, it would have been catastrophic for morale. If he'd followed the advice that he was getting. And likewise, Churchill, some of his most important impact on the war was the speeches he made, the impact he had on morale. And again, the decisions he made early on in the war not to negotiate, not to take the easy option and surrender. Even sort of Churchill's harshest critics. There's a famous essay by Christopher Hitchens from a couple of decades ago where he really, he sort of delved into all the revisionist history that looked at the ways in which Churchill had been exaggerated. And the one thing that he really couldn't fault him on, and said, I've looked at it again and again and I can't make it look any different, is that, darkest hour when he chose not to take the easy option, and he did choose to stand up and stand up to the Nazis and keep Britain in the war, rather than seek even a temporary peace. So I think those parallels are worthwhile. And again, the importance of travelling around and being seen. I think we've discussed it this week, and you've seen it in much of the media, the amazing logistics and dangers as well of Zelensky travelling out of Ukraine and going to the US, being escorted by American fighter jets and the like. Churchill was travelling all through the war, constantly, lots and lots of trips throughout the full length of it. And even early on, he was flying to Paris when it was on the brink of capitulation, and then when the French government had withdrawn from Paris, but before it had officially surrendered, he was still flying to France, flying across the Channel. Later on in the war, he travelled to North America, both by ship and by plane. The Telegraph published about a decade ago some previously unseen photographs, including one of Winston Churchill at the controls of his passenger plane, smoking a cigar with his sunglasses. And the Germans knew that this travel was happening and would have been trying their hardest, would have been absolutely delighted if they'd managed to shoot him down or sink one of his ships. And still he did it, and still he understood the importance of going to Quebec, of going to the front lines to North Africa. Even after D-Day, he sailed aboard a destroyer and apparently was delighted when it actually opened fire on some German positions. So he was getting fairly close to the action, maybe recklessly so. And you can see with Zelensky, even in this day and age, it's much easier for world leaders to communicate without leaving, and we've seen that with the fact that even though Zelensky, this is his first trip outside of Ukraine, he still managed to be interviewed by David Letterman for Netflix, and he still managed to deliver speeches to the UN, all this stuff from home. But the power of an in-person speech and seeing the man in person, turning up in Congress, receiving a standing ovation, delivering a flag from the front line, that kind of stuff matters. That making those Western allies feel like they're part of the battle, part of the defiance against a dictator, I think is really important. And you saw it as Churchill. One of the most important things he did was manage the relationship with the United States, both before and after the US joined the war. Yes, and you mentioned the criticism. We've seen a pair of Republicans who refused to take part in standing ovations, and one who even though he was in Washington, didn't go to the speech. And I think maybe more of the criticism has been from the public, from outside of Washington. How genuine all of it is, we can't say. But yeah, they focused on the fact that, even though he's a visiting dignitary, he was wearing his kind of traditional cargo trousers and combat sweater, and there's some kind of odd criticism of whether that was appropriate or not. But of course, this is a wartime leader. He doesn't strut around Ukraine in a suit. He wears those clothes when he's in Ukraine. And again, to reach back for the Churchill comparison, one that Zelensky clearly wants us to make, he became very famous for wearing a jumpsuit. At the time, they were known as siren suits, so it was a sort of necessity is the mother of all invention. People who were getting up in the night from air raid warnings in their pajamas and the like, all a bit embarrassing. And then you're in the air shelter in your skimpies. For want of a better word. So someone invented this onesie that was sort of vaguely formal, had a sort of a belt on it and pockets and looked vaguely suit-like, and Churchill absolutely loved his. And, the message of it was twofold. One, that he was in it with the rest, with everyone else. He had to get up in the middle of the night and go to an air raid shelter. He wasn't somehow above the difficulties of the war. But also, it kind of gave him this action man image, and he loved it so much that he had a pinstriped siren suit. So, actually the way you look and the way you dress is as important a part of your propaganda effort, if you want to call it that, as what you say.
Thank you very much, Dan, for that, for giving us some of the comparisons and some of the differences between Zelensky and Churchill, a comparison that many people have made. So I thought it would be quite good just to sort of get into it a little bit. So thank you, Dan. Dom, do you want to come in just very quickly? We've talked just in this last conversation about what happens when leaders get a bit too far forward. And it's something that, as Dan has elucidated, Churchill was very famous for doing and had to be held back on a few occasions. But also we've seen Zelensky go to the front, go to Bakhmut just a few days ago. And you had some thoughts on that. Would you take us through them?
Yeah, it's fascinating. Where does a leader, where does a commander put themselves on the battlefield in situations like this? There's the obvious balance between the morale-boosting kudos to go forward and meet the men and women who are fighting for what you're espousing back home, and against the obvious threat of how valuable are you? I mean, everyone, well, second in command is always one bullet away from commander, used to say. But even so, it'd be a huge loss for your senior leaders, military, civilian, politicians, civic leaders, etc., etc. If they are lost. So it's always a balance. It's always fascinating to see what commanders, where commanders place themselves, how they feel about it. We won't really know until after the event, and even then, we probably won't hear. But it'll be years later for the historians among us, the sort of Kapuros and their skimpsies, to let us know where Zelensky was all the time and what have you. But I mean, it is a fascinating subject. I just remember from my experience there. I won't mention any names, but there was a very senior unit commander in British Special Forces who would go out to visit troops in Iraq, and that's fine. You've got to go out and see what's going on. Got to sniff the wind and see exactly what it is on the ground. But this individual would put himself in far too close to the action. I mean, going out on some of the raids, stacking up at the door. I mean, it's just incredible. And I know of one instance where the director of Special Forces had to say to this individual, look, stop. You are wrong. You're doing the wrong thing here. You're too far over the line. That is not to happen. Those that know who I'm talking about. I'm not going to go any further, but it was just a really interesting mark that it still happens, and people get it right, get it wrong. I mean, generally the only wrong answer is if you get killed. I accept that. I accept that argument to a certain degree. But it's not just yourself. You're putting other people potentially at risk. All these things are being balanced in Zelensky's head and others. And the individual I've just mentioned, I mean, just went a little bit too far, or did he? I don't know. I mean, talking about it today, talking about it to you, so it puts these ideas out there. That the legacy of that episode lives on. So, was it the right or wrong thing to do? Debate. Can't really see that coming up on any A-level subject, but it's an interesting idea about where people put themselves. But as I say, I know from personal experience of a director who actually had to say, look, chum, you got to stop all this.
Thanks, Tom. Just one more question from me to both of you before we wrap up. We're at the final broadcast before Christmas, and we'll have a few more obviously next week before the end of the year. Dom, we're not going to hear from you for the next 2 weeks, so I was wondering if you just give us briefly your sort of, we've been covering this invasion now since the beginning. We'll carry on until the end. Where do you think we are right now? We've talked about American aid, we've talked about the Ukrainian army, and we've talked about what might happen next year. Would you just give us your potted thoughts on the stage of the war that you think we might be?
Well, I mean, first and foremost, if 9 months ago, you had said that we would be here debating how the war's going to go in 2023 and whether or not there will be a further Ukrainian offensive over the winter, I mean, we would have thought you were mad. The fact that the Ukrainian Air Force is still flying, the fact that the Russia's Black Sea Fleet is largely confined to port, the fact that the flagship, the Moskva, is at the bottom of the Black Sea. I mean, these are just staggering events to comprehend. So, I mean, I hope that we've all got it out of our systems by now to think, oh wow, these plucky Ukrainians, they can actually put up a fight. I mean, that boat sailed a long time ago. I hope for all of us, for most of us. So I think what's going to happen now is we look through the winter. So what's happening? Ukraine is training professionally, but in very small numbers. I.e., training. There's a large effort here in the UK of a cast of I think a dozen countries now supplying instructors to train Ukraine infanteers, as in civilians, giving them basic infantry training. There's a lot of training across Europe in the technical aspects, in the heavy weapons, the artillery, as Patriot will come up on that, HIMARS, etc., not only in how to fight these things, but how to maintain them and keep them going, which is just as important. As much as I hate to talk about logistics in that way, but it is very important. So all this stuff is going on. On the other side, Russia has largely used up its precision-guided munitions. It is out of ideas. It's never had a moral centre upon which it can draw to encourage people to go and fight. It's having to mobilise people. It's looking like there might be another round of mobilisation in the new year, or at the very least an extension to the conscript terms of service. So on the one hand, you can see it just calcifying, and this line that hasn't moved really since that lightning advance around Kharkiv in September. That's not moved much in the north. The south, again, since the withdrawal from Kharkiv, not a huge amount of movement there. And there's just been this grinding, relentless, horrific fight in the centre around Bakhmut, which is incredibly violent. So in all likelihood, it's going to calcify. The lines will calcify, and the longer that lasts, the more there will be pressure, I would imagine, internationally for some sort of accommodation, some negotiation, which Ukraine said just ain't happening. But I think those calls will continue if the lines don't move. Now there could be another lightning breakthrough from Ukraine, and I think that is looking most likely in the around the Zaporizhia area. If they were able to push down towards Melitopol on the south coast and then split off those forces that are in Crimea and in Kherson Oblast, that's just north of Crimea, split them away from the forces to the east, so sever that land corridor, then I think that could be absolutely pivotal, because that land corridor, we think, is what this whole fight is all about. So that could be very, very important. The chances of Russia doing something significant is unlikely, i.e. pushing down through Belarus, very unlikely. The ground really doesn't lend itself there. They tried it once, didn't work last time. So I don't think that Kyiv is going to come under significant threat from the ground again. They've just not been able to manage that. They've not got their act together on the combined arms way of fighting wars, having all the different parts of the military orchestra working together. So I can't see any ideas or any potential great breakthrough from Russia. I think the ball very much is in Ukraine's court right now. Whether or not they can get the numbers of trained people and keep going economically is the issue there. And for Russia, it's literally when they run out of stuff. I mean, there's talk of them having to use do deals with Belarus and elsewhere, Iran maybe, to get other ground troops in there. But it doesn't come to anything. I mean, when we heard about all these fighters from Syria, I mean, months ago, do you remember this? That we're going to get all these brigades were going to flow in from Syria. Yeah, I haven't seen them. They haven't turned up. So it's just they can offer nothing. So I think it's going to be a hard winter. I still wouldn't discount a significant, if small, chance of Ukraine breaking through over the winter. As the ground hardens, they're much better able to use maneuver warfare, as in physical movement and knitting everything together. But I think it's going to be a hard fight through the winter, and then I can't see much changing until the spring. But I think the impetus and the momentum in this war is very much in Ukraine's favour. And then by next summer, I reckon there'll be some very, very serious questions to be faced with, i.e. if Russia is facing imminent military defeat on the battlefield, where then for this discussion about nuclear escalation, which is we've dabbled with, and Putin loves to raise the spectre. He rattles that cage all the time. But I think if there's a significant chance of battlefield defeat, then it's time to sort of unpack some of those arguments once again.
I just want to follow up very quickly on something that Dom said about, who would have thought we'd be where we were. I kind of want to return actually to sort of a thought from very, very early on in the invasion, which was kind of this shocked reaction in Europe of, just bemusement that somehow there was major war again in the European continent, that there hadn't been for decades. And I think that feeling is kind of returning again and coming back as we in Western Europe kind of prepare for Christmas, and there's discussion about energy crisis this and that, and difficult winter for us here. But actually, amazingly, there's a whole population in Ukraine that is spending a Christmas at war, which is a staggering thing to say about Europe in 2020. And you're seeing a kind of a repetition of things that we saw in London, the city that we're talking from. Decades ago, they had 1940, they had Blitzmas, and people basically tried to do Christmas as normal, but they were underground in the tube, singing Christmas carols, trying to make do, so they couldn't get hold of turkey, but they had beef and mutton that had been shipped in from Australia and New Zealand and Canada, and really trying to make do. The royal family did their Christmas card picture, so we've seen the Christmas card picture this year, and it's sort of taken in the summer, which is a bit odd, but in 1940 the royal family took theirs in front of the bit of Buckingham Palace that had been bombed. So there was a sort of effort to make it normal. But yeah, it's kind of, I think it's a moment again to just think about how insane it is that one man really has pushed the continent back decades really to something that I don't think most people thought they would see in their lifetimes, at least not in Europe.
Thank you very much, Dan Capuro. Dom Nichols, would you like the very final thoughts?
Yeah, well, I think I've said all I need to say on the actual battlefield. I just want to say for those people who have joined us this year and stayed with us, thank you so much for your attention and for helping keep us honest and keep us straight. We've made a couple of missteps along the way, but you've called us out on that, and that's great. I urge you all to please keep doing that. Keep taking your information from a whole wide range of sources, and we'll see you over the next few days, and we'll see you in 2023. Thanks very much for joining us.
Ahead of Christmas, my colleague Claire Hubble spoke to representatives from Lumos, a charity providing support to children displaced by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. She spoke to Ukraine Country Director Galina Bulat and Head of Marketing and Communications Freya Polite. Claire started by asking Galina what Lumos are providing for children in Ukraine. Just to note, there's quite a lot of noise in the background of Galina's audio during this interview, but we hope you find it fruitful nonetheless.
As one of the consequences of the crisis in the first weeks of the war, it was issued a resolution of the Ukrainian government that all children from residential institutions who have parents have to be returned to their families. And for example, in the region we are working with, in Zhytomyr, there were 1,300 children who returned to families. Most of them are very poor families, because poverty in Ukraine is one of the main drivers of institutionalization of children. So most of those children, families, faced lack of food as a basic need and urgent need. So therefore, the aid or humanitarian aid we are providing consists of primarily from food, but also, as you mentioned, clothes, especially for children in these collective centers for IDPs, and educational materials, again for the same purpose, to have at least some items to continue to learn, to continue education in different conditions, because since February until May, it was only exclusively distance learning. So many of children haven't been prepared for such type of education. And depending from one case to another one, we, for example, if there are babies in a family, we bought and provided special meal for young children, and many other such things, hygiene items, diapers, and so on.
And when you speak to the children that Lumos aids, what is their understanding of what's going on in regards to the invasion?
First of all, we are not speaking directly with the children very often, only in special context, in special situations, because there are very rigorous safeguarding rules we have to follow. But when we have such an opportunity, I should say that children remain children in any context. They are happy when they receive gifts. They are saying that these educational materials, for example, are gifts for them. So they are happy. Also, they are happy to know that they will have what to eat for dinner or for supper and so on. But at the same time, we can see how children became more mature or more adult in their behavior, in what they are saying, because they started to speak using phrases or content which is more familiar for adults, not for children. And this is because of the context, because what is happening in their lives. So it is sad actually to see this, because as I mentioned, children should remain children in any situation, but unfortunately this crisis has a huge impact on their well-being, psychological situation. That is why the government decided that the provision of psychosocial support is one of the priorities. And apart from Lumos, there are many other organizations, international and local organizations, who provide the same support.
Thank you. As you say, these are really unthinkable conditions for children to grow up in. I wonder, have there been any moments that sort of spring to mind for you that have provided lightness and an opportunity for children to, as you say, be children?
We are now in the process of organizing a Christmas party for a group of children. It will take place next Monday. We decided to bring together a group of children with disabilities, children from foster families, and children from IDPs families. They will come with their parents and or cares, and there is a hope that this Christmas party will bring a little bit more joy, happiness, and light in their life, because just to imagine that for months some children are spending their time and their lives in collective centers or in shelters without light, without water, qualitative food, and so on. So this is a moment we are thinking about now, to just for this purpose, to bring a little bit more light in their life. We will we invited 4 professional actors from the local theater. They will organize some activities, to play, to sing, and many other such activities. It will happen in a very child-friendly space. It will be a Christmas tree there, so it will be a holiday for them.
That's lovely to hear. Going back to what you were saying about the psychosocial training provided for professionals in Ukraine who are working with these vulnerable families, could you tell us a bit more about what that training looks like and what kind of tools the professionals are trying to equip these vulnerable children with in order to deal with and heal from the trauma they're subjected to?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mentioned about the National Training of Trainers program. It was organized with the purpose to cover more, to cover the national level, to cover the entire country, because the needs are huge, are very high. Many of professionals in the systems left Ukraine, evacuated in the first weeks and months to save their families, and large groups of children remained without any support and help. So and we decided, as I mentioned, together with the ministry, to organize this training of trainers program. These national trainers to come back to their regions to cascade the training they received, and in this way to spread the training and to cover more and more regions, communities, and so on. And the training program consists of 4 modules. One would be how to learn psychologists and social workers and professionals from the child affairs services how to communicate with children about the crisis, how to teach them to overcome trauma, how to become more resilient in terms of psychological status and emotions, how to deal with loss, because many children lost parents or grandparents or friends or relatives. And another module was to how to work with parents, to teach parents how to communicate with their children or with the children from neighbor families, from relative families. And also was a module for teachers, for schools and kindergartens teachers, again, to teach them how to inform, how to speak, how to communicate with children about these awful things around them. So we considered all the groups who are involved in these processes around children themselves, but also professionals around the children to be prepared to support children. These professionals use different techniques: art therapy, melotherapy, play therapy, and other such methods to work with the children. However, in all these processes, the main problem is the lack of professionals. I mentioned about the fact that many of them fled Ukraine, are abroad somewhere, and this gap is very has very significant consequences on children's situation, because there are no psychologists to deal with this. Yes, there are hotlines children can call somebody, but no this consistent support and ongoing support. And there are officials from the Ministry of Social Policy, from the Ministry of Education, who are saying that probably even the war will end soon. There will be a big need or a huge need on psychosocial support for children for many years ahead because of the trauma they are suffering now.
I can imagine.
Obviously, we speak to various people all the time, both in Ukraine, but also from neighbouring countries, people who've left Ukraine, so sort of reflecting the different issues. One lady, so Elena, was heavily pregnant when she left Ukraine for Moldova earlier this year with her 4 daughters. Her husband, Vasily, stayed behind to look after Elena's mother, and shortly after crossing the border, Elena gave birth to a little boy, Bogdan. They could carry little with them and had nothing for the new baby at all. But so in this situation, Lumos supported the family, providing clothes and a pram for baby Bogdan. And Bogdan has since been able to meet his father in person, and the family are starting a new life together, far away from their original home. So, that was a sort of positive ending, but obviously from a very sad situation. We then could mention a woman, Ivana, who was a grandmother, and she left Kharkiv for Zhytomyr with her 3 granddaughters, aged just 15, 10 and 5. The girls' parents had to stay behind to work. At the beginning of the war, the family slept in the school's bomb shelter as their house was bombed. It was really very cold. The children are still very frightened. Even now, when the siren sounds, the 5-year-old runs to the bomb shelter and cries, "Tell the man to stop shooting." The family had planned to go home, but when infrastructure began to be destroyed, they had to change their plans. So Lumos has supported Ivana and her granddaughters with food, clothing, and psychological support. And Ivana describes Lumos's help as heating up our souls. Then we have a situation from Sophia, who's just 17. She's the oldest of 5 children, and she lives in the same home as when the war began at the moment, but her education has been severely disrupted by the war. Her education is crucial for her. She wanted to study biology at university and then teach or work in a laboratory, but she says that she doesn't know her future anymore. Lumos has been supporting the family by providing educational resources as well as vital supplies such as food and hygiene items. Money is very tight, and Sophia's dad lost his job when the war began, and her mother Vera earns a low salary. Vera says, "Because of Lumos's support, we can now survive." And then we have Alina, who is a mother of 2 young daughters, and they have moved 4 times since the start of the war, fleeing bombing and explosions. Before the war, Alina was a nurse, but now she is unable to work as there is no one to stay at home with her children. They depend on help from organisations like Lumos to survive, particularly because they live in a more rural area. The children are studying online, but sometimes it can take all day as the electricity keeps dropping out.
Yeah, maybe one more fact that we are cooperating and partnering with many other international organizations. We are a member of international platforms such as BTK Network, also Ukraine Ukraine group under BTK Network. Clusters created by OCHA in Ukraine in education and child protection, and we are using these platforms to share our principles, our values, to engage international community in making everything is possible to keep children together with their parents, to prevent families breakdown, to prevent increase in institutionalization of children, because it is very well known that in times of crisis the numbers of institutionalized children increase. So we are doing a lot of advocacy work, not only providing food in Ukraine, but on the other side, doing this advocacy work to, as I mentioned, to engage the international community in not losing children from the agenda, from the recovery processes, because maybe you know that Ukraine announced the renewal of Ukraine program. There are different plans in different domains. So we are fighting to keep focus on children and children's rights.
Now, I'm sure our listeners will be wondering if there's a way that we can help Lumos. What's the most effective way for them to do that?
The best way to support us really is to go onto our website and to see how to get involved. That we are running an appeal over the Christmas period for funds, which will support our work all over the world. But we also have an appeal for our work in Ukraine. We obviously need funds to do the vital work that we do and to support children. So we're always looking for support for that.
Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your input, and don't lose touch with us. We'd love to hear more about your really important work.
Thank you. Thank you very much for giving this opportunity to speak with you.
Thank you.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. And sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review, as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. We do read every message, and we are especially interested to hear where you are listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Claire Hubble. Hi listeners, David Knowles here. Just to say, Francis and I have left Telegraph Towers, our office in Victoria, for the last time this side of Christmas, heading back to our respective homes over the Christmas period. As you know, the next week we won't be having the live episodes on Monday or Tuesday, but we will be having special pre-recorded episodes on the life and times of Taras Shevchenko, Ukraine's possibly Ukraine's most famous poet, artist and writer. And we just wanted to say thank you for listening over the past year. It's been a year that I don't think any of us expected, but we hope we've done our absolute best, we think, in terms of bringing you the news, bringing you the best analysis we can. We've emerged obviously from these offices and the sort of revolving doors. Everything's light and heated, and come into the street and we can see people with their bags as they head home for the holidays, surrounded by lit up office buildings and traffic rolling past. And we're just aware that this is not the case, obviously, for many of our listeners, especially in Ukraine. And we just wanted to say we are thinking of you over this Christmas period, and really hope you can have the best Christmas possible. And yeah, just want you to know that we're thinking of you, and we'll be back in the after Christmas and then sort of properly in the new year to carry on our work. And thank you very much for all of your messages, and if you celebrate, Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas from a very wintry London.